Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Questions?
Hello. Yeah, thank you. Well, I see choosing between the missile defense and the deterrence. It's like choosing between the devil and the deep blue sea. Emily Landau has well pointed out that the missile defense it's more of a complementary in nature to the nuclear deterrence, which I personally feel it's actually a choice for the countries who are not being able to procure the nuclear deterrence, perhaps Israel exception. Again, another comment I've seen, it's basically what we would be doing, our strategy. The presenters have focused on what US, South Korea, Israel, they would be doing. What the enemies would be doing, it's now a fourth generation warfare going on, whereby you have non-state actors that are being backed by states. The scenario in Middle East is quite different from North Korea, by the way. You have like a number of non-state actors. And I see there can be a possible situation whereby a state can encourage a non-state actor to pursue a counter value strategy. And is the missile defense capable enough to defend a counter value strategy which uses tactical nukes? This is my question. The tactical nukes, in fact.
Maybe take a few questions.
Would you like to respond?
Did you want to?
No, I thought maybe you'd take a few questions and we can answer, or however.
Should we get
I think that's what she's suggesting.
Yeah. Okay.
If there are other questions.
Additional questions?
I'd like to push to an absurd with this question. If anti-ballistic missile is doing some weakening deterrence, so why the SAMs are not weakening the aircraft attacks, or the torpedoes not weakening the submarine attacks? So where do you stop? You have a trial forces that can shoot nuke, and you're just looking at the ballistic missile denial and not aircraft or submarine denials.
Additional comments, questions? So perhaps we'll start. Emily, would you like?
Alex, you want me to take those on? We really worry. While you have non-state actors in the Middle East, you've also got in the Korean situation, just trying to draw the analogy, you have special forces in North Korea, about 200,000 special forces. There is considerable worry that ballistic missiles is not the only way to deliver even nuclear weapons, but certainly chemical or biological weapons. And so the defense cannot be purely a missile defense approach, and counterforce will have some other elements that it will be pursuing. We do worry, though, about the fact that either here in the Middle East or in Korea, you've got to be able to do this multidimensional kind of defense. An adversary, somebody in Lebanon could have a ballistic missile capability that is big enough to deliver a nuclear weapon. So not just a small artillery rocket, but a big rocket. If you've got that kind of capability, I sure hope you have missile defenses personally. I think that's the right kind of response, because you're not going to stop the first launch of those. You don't know for sure what it is. You may not even detect that they've got that capability. So I think you do want missile defenses. And I don't think that, my personal view is that missile defenses do not undermine the deterrence situation. I think they're very helpful. It is the counterforce capabilities, in my mind, which are more destabilizing. I think the missile defenses are less destabilizing. Now, I still want to have the counterforce capabilities very much, but we have to be much more careful about how we posture those so that we don't completely destabilize, and you have this trade-off of stability.
Emily, would you like to?
Well, look, I mean, I think, you know, we had this conceptual, oh, sorry. We thought it was necessary to have this conceptual panel in this conference exactly to highlight this conundrum, I would say, with regard to deterrence and missile defense, and this basic question, is one undercutting the other, or are these complementary strategies? And this is at the heart of strategic thinking with regard to these issues. And I'm not sure that there's a clear-cut answer. I mean, Reuven in the previous session made a very clear case that missile defense undercuts deterrence, that if you get the message across to the other side that you're willing to even contemplate the fact that a missile will be fired at you, you are weakening your own deterrence. But this actually goes against the thinking that has characterized the superpower experience, because even taking into account, Reuven, what you said about McNamara, the United States has still continued with missile defenses. They didn't end. Not to mention that Bush, unilaterally exited the ABM later on. So missile defense is still very strongly integrated into strategic thinking with regard to nuclear issues. And I think that overall, I would say the main conclusion is that you better have all the layers that you can have in place. You want everything that you can get, and your assumption is, but I mean, I take Reuven's point that he wants to get across the deterrent message from Israel's point of view, because it's such a small country, because it's so devastating, any kind of missile attack that might come from Iran. He wants the message to be any missile that's fired before we know even whether it's, because we're not going to have time, and if it's nuclear, it's game over. And I think his point is a valid point that can't just be brushed away. But I think it's important for everyone here that's thinking seriously about these issues. This is the crux of the issue. Do you want those layers, and do you believe in those layers? And you better have, all the kinds of protection that you can have, deterrence by punishment, deterrence by denial, etc. Or, is the logic that Reuven presented a sound logic that we should be taking seriously? But I don't have the answer for it, although my inclination is definitely to go for the layers. But if we've pinpointed this question and just, highlighted it even more, that's sort of just to inject that into whatever debate is going on these crucial issues.
Well, for me, it all depends. I think that in the Cold War...
Well, that's if you have a relativist.
I'm a relativist, yes. Trust me, I'm a relativist. In the Cold War, it seems to me the ABM Treaty was a good thing, because there was an obsession with the competition with central strategic systems, and that was an enormous source of distrust, paranoia, and waste of resources. The ABM Treaty, although it didn't stop American developments, nor Russian, it did de-emphasize them. It made that central balance somewhat more secure and dependable, and I think that was a good thing. The argument about why it should end was that that central nuclear standoff had ceased to be the dominant concern of US security or the security of its allies, and therefore it made sense to look at other alternatives. So that's I think, the difference. on Riven's point, I still don't quite understand why there would be any doubt that if Israel suffered a nuclear attack or even a devastating conventional attack, that it would retaliate. I mean, it doesn't.
No, he doesn't want even the first.
But then you're talking about preemption, which is hard to achieve, isn't it?
Talking about deterrence, not preemption.
Well, if you are saying you wouldn't let even the possibility of a missile being fired, that's put morality on one side. That's technically hard to be assured. You're doing launch on warning or before warning, actually, and that's making a lot of people in the Middle East and beyond extremely uncomfortable. And we've had that, discussion. But that, I think, is the difference and the answer. In response to the first question, I'm not persuaded that non-state actors are such a big threat. Could they do tactical nuclear attacks? Could they get the nukes? It seems uncertain. Could they do it? Certainly. Could they do multiple attacks in ways that would be a major? A what?
They are backed by states.
They're what?
They are supported by states.
Well, they might be, but this is another question about whether states have ever actually handed over nukes to non-state actors, with all the consequences that might flow from that. So I'm not convinced that we have evidence that states would do it, and even if they did, I don't believe that you'd easily get extremely threatening multiple attack preemption scenarios coming out of that. So that's why I don't think it fits all that much. On why we're obsessed with ABMs rather than other kinds of missiles, well, it's a psychological obsession with where nukes, what nukes are most likely to be carried on, and what deals with those systems. And while they're on ballistic missiles, then anti-ballistic missile systems will become highly diplomatically salient. The point I wanted to make about Korea, though, is what you haven't mentioned there, is the other things that would be happening, which is the massive devastation of Seoul by conventional artillery, which can't really be stopped either. You can knock down some artillery in the air, you could go after the tube artillery and the rockets around Seoul, but still you've got the prospect of massive and essentially unstoppable conventional devastation, which goes on anyway. And that seems to me a rather important point to bring in the calculation.
Yeah. May I just, on a couple of quick points. First, the June 2013 document that Emily mentioned, the U.S. Nuclear Employment Strategy, explicitly denounces assured destruction as an approach. It states that the United States will not target civilian populations. There are people who are uncomfortable with that, but that is an explicit part of this administration's nuclear strategy. Point number two, we have to think about the steps in a nuclear escalation. Let's say that Iran doesn't just have one nuclear weapon, it has 20. Okay? At some point in time, that could well be the case. They fire one nuclear weapon and it hits Tel Aviv and it goes off, and your leadership has authorized a massive retaliation against Iran. Are they going to do that knowing that Iran will then fire those other 19 weapons at Israel? And it is that step which deterred the United States and led to U.S. flexible response doctrine in the 60s and in the 70s to extreme elements of, well, we have to be prepared to deal with the ones and the twos and the fives. We can't just have this assured destruction response and take massive damage to the U.S. As I said, there is a huge difference between one weapon going off and 5 or 10 or 20 weapons going off in our countries. And so that's a big difference. The other thing on the U.S. missile defense, way before the Ballistic Missile Defense Treaty, the U.S. Pentagon had decided in the very early 1960s that we could not pursue missile defense against the vastly expanded Soviet arsenal that was being produced. There was a whole series of studies done by Glenn Kent, then an Air Force colonel and eventually a 3-star. And the basic calculation they made was the cost for the Soviets to add one more warhead was about 1/10 the cost for us to be able to shoot down one more warhead when you're talking about thousands of warheads being involved. And so it was a losing proposition to trade off, and that was what drove the United States to be willing to do the Missile Defense Treaty, because we thought it would be okay to protect our retaliation, but we couldn't afford to go to the more extensive. But if you're talking about an adversary who doesn't have thousands of nuclear weapons, but who has 5 or 10 or 20, that's a wholly different circumstance. And that's what's leading to the serious consideration of missile defense and combined with it counterforce in Korea.
Any additional questions?
According to you, I assume that you suggest of our leaders that if it were the question that one nuclear weapon will be launched on Tel Aviv, we will not retaliate. Why? Because the extra retaliation will cost worse. And this is not a common consideration, because if the other side knows that, for sure he will launch the one retaliation. This is it is a game. It is the game theory. Yes. What will be the next reaction of the other? This is to be considered. Another question: you did mention the last affairs, what happened in North Korea, between the debate and of the family of the leaders, that his own is uncle to the live dogs. And I heard nothing story before I read that he used anti-aircraft weapons to execute him. It is something that based on the fear. Is it nothing to be in consideration on that nuclear facilities of the North Korea, that based on fear? Thank you.
Would you like to respond?
Sure. Part of the U.S. strategy development in the 60s was looking at flexible response. There was no case where we were anticipating that an adversary would use a nuclear weapon against the U.S. and we would not respond with a nuclear weapon. The question is, would we fire 500 nuclear weapons against one fired at us? Or would we fire 1 or 2 or 3, hoping to keep it contained at that kind of level? And then the question became, okay, what can you do with 1 or 2 or 3 weapons that's going to hurt him worse than you've been hurt? Most of that focused on going against the leadership of the opposing country. Either that or his nuclear forces to try to incapacitate them. So it was almost immediately a counterforce response, very limited in size. And a lot of detail went into those kinds of assessments. A part, again, of this June 2013 document is a statement in it that the United States will respond to nuclear weapon use with a proportional response. And proportional is normally interpreted as, if you've fired 1, we will maybe fire 1 or 2 or 3, but we're not going to fire 50 or 100. What you're trying to do is to convince the other guy that A, you can do a lot of damage to him, B, he doesn't want to escalate, and C, hopefully you've also taken out his ability to escalate in the short term. And so those are the kinds of things you usually try to do in that low-level kind of exchange. On the uncle, there have been all kinds of stories about how the uncle was killed, including the dog story and so forth. The big important thing about the uncle, though, in this case is, it was always the case in North Korea that there were several hundred families of the very senior leaders who were protected. The uncle had been purged twice before and came back. This is different because now they have violated that guarantee to the senior families. If they are indeed purged in the future, they're subject to execution. That means their families are also subject to being sent off to the gulag. Now you've changed the incentives for those senior families to try to assassinate the leader if they're concerned about their future. Now you've created tremendous instability. So there was not an adequate level of thinking about what they were doing, but that seems to reflect the youth of Kim Jong-un. The current leader has made a number of mistakes like that, and so.
Thank you very much indeed. We have now lunch, and we meet again at 12:30.